My name is Mike Brostoff. I was born the youngest of 4 kids. When I was very young, I received attention unconditionally. Even if I didn't want it, I got it. Consequently, I developed unrealistic expectations of the rest of the world. I was the kid in class who asked a million questions and who always wanted to share every cognition about the material. I always was jealous anytime someone received more attention than myself. If someone didn't give me the attention I expected, then I considered it a rejection. Finally, at the age of 30, I realized I would never get the attention from the rest of the world that I was looking for. So in order to satiate my appetite, I've decided to host my own show on Community Access, where for an hour or half hour, a couple times a month, I am the center of attention. Welcome to the Center of Attention. I'm Mike Brostoff, and the guest for this evening's show is Rick Prelinger. And Rick Prelinger may be familiar to many of you as the person who collects old movies, especially industrial films and educational films. So maybe not as in person, but if you watch Nick at Night or Mystery Science 3000, they take from your collection, don't they? And if you see those old kind of real campy, they're not meant to be campy, but what were supposed to be the standards of the 30s, 40s, and 50s, and even some in the 60s, Rick is the person responsible for bringing them to you. And so we're going to talk to Rick about his collection tonight and some of the products he is currently marketing with them. So welcome to the show, Rick.
Thanks, Mike.
Yeah, I was hoping to open up the show actually with a clip from one of your films that you collected, but unfortunately we don't have them here with us tonight. So why don't you describe a couple of them, maybe one or two of your favorites that stick out to give us a flavor of these type of shows.
Well, I think most people will recognize this material from deep in their past. They're the films that were made to educate us, maybe to miseducate us, to teach us how to be good consumers, good students, industrious workers, patriotic citizens.
Right. Can you give us an example? Do you have one that particularly is your favorite that...
Well, what's a favorite? A Date with Your Family is a great film. That's a film about how to behave at home when you're with your family at dinner. And the idea is that you're supposed to behave as though you're with somebody you really wanted to be with. You really wanted to be with, like you were out on a date. And it proposes that you lie and that you be dishonest at home in the interest of family harmony.
Right. I remember hearing that. In fact, that's the one I think Terry Gross played on her show.
Yeah.
And there were some of the lines from it where
it says a pleasant, unemotional conversation helps the digestion. And it says, this is nothing like looking at the films themselves, but it says the boys greet their dad as he comes home for dinner, and the narrator says, the voice of authority, God says, these boys treat their dad as though they are genuinely glad to see him, as though they really missed being away from him. They fake it. And that's, in a certain sense, what a lot of these films are about, predictable behavior. At least the educational films, training citizens who wouldn't, kind of swerve out of the lane, but who would follow a predictable path.
Yeah, exactly. We should mention, too, one of the products. Rick has recently produced a CD-ROM, and later on we'll get to see a clip of that. But it's going to come up in the chroma key in a moment, which basically shows the intro of it. And that's what we'll see throughout the show tonight is a clip from Rick's CD-ROM, and that is just his introduction. But before we'll get to the CD-ROM, I just wanted to explain what would be up there. I wanted to ask you, how did you start collecting these films? Like, how did you connect up with them?
I was working as a researcher on a documentary film, which later became Heavy Petting. It came out in...
Oh, I think I remember that.
Yeah, 1989. It was different when we started working on it, but it was a film about sex and romance in the 20th century.
Right.
And the story about sexuality and romance in the 20th century, isn't such a happy one. It's not about people, living a utopian, fulfilled life. It's about people being nervous and people being told what to do and people being unsatisfied. And there's no better way to get into that early training into our social conditioning about gender issues than by looking at these old social guidance films. There's hundreds of them. We have about 200 of them.
Right.
And they're an incredibly dense source of information about how we were supposed to behave. It's funny films because on the one hand they're about how we really were. They're much truer to life than feature films or TV or whatever. But on the other hand, they're very idealized. They're about how we were supposed to be, how we were supposed to behave.
Right. But how did you decide to use these as a resource? What made you make that connection of these old films would be a great source? How'd you think of that versus old feature films? What
happened was I was collecting, and after a couple of years, people started to come to me, and they were willing to pay me for access to my collection. I mean, this was astonishing, that a film that I bought for $15 might have some value. Of course, I didn't learn until later that it's very expensive to run film archives, and I'm not rich. But what came out of that was a business where I was selling stock footage to just about everybody that wanted to use material, and then I began to get frustrated and a little bit unhappy because everybody else was using this stuff and I wasn't. And people were also taking it out of context. They were taking little bits and pieces out of the material and using it to kind of add a nostalgic or a quaint tinge to commercials. But they were doing almost it's fine, but it was a rip-off. It didn't use the films in their historical context. And what's worse than that, it didn't tell us anything about where we had been and why we are the way we are now. And so I started working with Voyager, making at first laser discs and then some videotapes, which are now sold as a CD-ROM called Ephemeral Films from the Voyager company. And then over the last 2 years, I've been working on this new series, which is called Our Secret Century. And that's something very new for me and very exciting.
The Secret Century, which we see a bit of a shot of up behind us, that CD-ROM is just incredible. I got a chance to see it in Toronto back in October. But recently, today, just before we did the show, I had a chance to look at it, and it's could be a whole course in and of itself. It's fascinating and entertaining. We'll get a chance to see a clip. I wanted to ask you, though, did you expect when you started to collect these that there would be a market for this, that would become this really in-fashion thing for major networks to want to take clips of it to supplement like Nick at Night does, or even something like Mystery Theater 3000? Did you have any idea that this would become a big thing?
No, I really thought I was just an outsider collecting junk, like everybody. Most people do in this country. We're a nation of junk collectors. But it seems to have hit some kind of a nerve. And it's not just the old material. It's I think presenting it in context. It's the idea that we're going back to this stuff for a reason. We're getting a laugh out of it. But it's not just about getting a laugh. It's really about understanding.
It's evidence of our past.
This is also a very insecure time right now. There's a lot of things that people used to have faith in or have broken down. And in the upcoming turn of the century, the millennium, almost like in the air, there's all kinds of questioning and social insecurity. And it seems to foster, to encourage people to look back a little bit.
Who was the first person who contacted you to say, we want to use this for our network? What was the first?
Oh, is it very early in the game?
Very early that you're collecting this materials and somebody came to you and said, yes, we want to use this for a commercial, we want to use this for a documentary. What was the first contact that was made for this material? The
first contact was somebody from the News Show, which was a short-lived Lorne Michaels program.
Oh, okay.
A spin-off of Saturday Night Live, which was not successful. But the first real big job was Nickelodeon.
Right.
Because
Oh, so
Nick
they-
was starting a program called Turkey Television, and they wanted a lot of material, cheap airtime.
Yeah.
So they licensed, they did this huge deal with me, and of course I thought, what a wonderful business. I never
Right.
did anything so
Yeah.
big as that again, practically. But that enabled me to get started, to acquire more films,
Yeah.
and to, begin to come to terms with what I'd already collected.
Right.
It's funny in those days because I was in one little room and I had a lot
Yeah.
of films, and now, it's way beyond that.
And did they make the contact with you from the new show? How did they know to come to you for?
A friend who was doing film research
Okay.
gave me a buzz, and she came down and looked at a few things.
Was that like very exciting when that moment happened? Like when that person called you and said, "Yes, we want to buy all this footage." What was that moment like?
It was kind of anticlimactic.
Oh, really?
It was exciting to work, on a
Yeah.
fairly collaborative level with people at a cable network later on. And it was
Yeah.
really interesting to kind of learn about how the mainstream media industry in New York works.
Right.
And I did it for about 10 years, and then it began to wear a little thin, and I don't sell stock footage anymore.
Right.
There's another company that represents me.
Yeah.
So I just work with the archives. I don't have to talk to
Right.
clients anymore.
Oh, that's good. And what was your impression of these when you were kids? When you were a kid and watching these films? I mean, what did you think of them when you saw them in first grade, second grade, third grade? What was your impression at that point?
I was kind of a movie-deprived kid.
Yeah.
We didn't get to go to the movies very often. My parents, my father was European, and he didn't really believe very much in American culture, and he thought, that Walt Disney was poisoning kids' minds.
Right.
And so we didn't get to go to a lot of kids' movies, and as a result, we begged to go to movies,
Yeah.
anything.
Right.
So in school, when we'd see something about, breathing, it was fascinating. Or when we saw the old Frank Capra science films,
Right.
Dr. Frank Baxter, people remember Our Mr. Sun and
Yeah,
Hemo the
yeah.
Magnificent, About a Blood. Those are pretty big occasions. So film had kind of a magic to it, not a star magic. I never
Right.
much cared about actors and actresses or anything like that, but I was fascinated with the movies. And
Yeah.
even then, when I was a kid,
Right.
I was interested not just in what you saw in the middle of the frame,
Right.
but what was happening in the periphery. Like if there was a film that took place in Atlanta in the 30s. I wanted to see what was on the side. I wanted to see the
Right.
city and the landscape. I wasn't so interested in what was happening in the middle. In fact, the
Exactly.
first film I started to collect in 1982 was a film on safety, pedestrian safety in Oakland, made in 1948, and I'd lived in Oakland in California. And I was
Yeah.
fascinated with what that film showed about the look of the streets and the look of the city.
Yeah.
Back then, it's a time capsule thing for me.
Right. And as a kid, when you saw some of the more hokier ones, do you remember being like influenced or internalizing any of those messages?
No.
Or do you remember thinking that was phony, that you saw through it when you were at a young age?
Yeah, I pretty much saw through it.
Right.
Probably most kids did.
Exactly. What we should do is we should talk now a little bit about what Rick is doing with this material. He just released his first CD-ROM, as he said earlier. Everybody else was taking his material and doing stuff with it, and so he wanted to have a chance to work with it. And like I said, I saw it this afternoon, and it's the most incredible CD-ROM I've seen before. I mean, currently, I'm sure you would agree, a lot of people who produce CD-ROMs don't really know what to do with them. They're just taking all these separate mediums and putting them on one disc, and they don't really complement each other. The different medium don't help explain what's happening, but Rick has really taken all these materials and integrated them into a whole that really explains his thesis. And at this point, as soon as you guys are ready in the control room, we'll go and we'll get to see like the opening of his CD-ROM, and he kind of gives a good explanation of what this whole series is about. So when you guys are ready, just let it roll.
Now, here is a motion picture film, 1,000 feet, 16,000 separate photographs. Let's tidy up this tangle of film by putting it on a reel.
So what's so secret about this century anyway? And why did I call a collection of zany films our secret century? Well, here's what I was thinking. There's three sets of secrets that I think are expressed in this disc. The first is about history itself. but not the kind of history that we learned about in school, names, places, and famous people. It's histories, really, that have been forgotten and have to do with daily life, how our landscape looked, how people communicated and interacted with one another, especially things like body language and patterns of speech, how we worked for a living and what we did for leisure, and much, much more.
And so they joined the stream of family life in the suburbs.
The clarion call of industry sounds good morning to America's manpower.
These are things that aren't usually described in history books, and you have to go to evidence left over from the past to see them. Now, the films you'll see on this disc are some of the best ways to examine the past, and really that's why I started collecting them. Almost every frame, every image is filled with evidence about times, places, and human behavior that have changed or are now completely extinct. That's the first set of secrets, which I guess you could kind of call the way we were. The second set is buried deeper than the first, and you could really call them the way we were supposed to be. These are these old messages that were passed down through advertising, through the mass media, and through propaganda. Messages about how we were supposed to conduct our lives, how we were supposed to behave, what we were supposed to buy, and last but not least, what to think.
Keep sober. Nice. Stop when angry. Obey all laws.
And finally, the last set of secrets is the films themselves. I call them secrets because they were not intended to survive. We're seeing them only by a lucky accident. In fact, for some of these films, you'll be among the first people to see them since they were ever made.
Oh wait, it'll come up in a second. Okay, go ahead.
This is disc 1 of a series of 12 CD-ROMs, which are called collectively Our Secret Century. The first 4 actually are coming out this next week. The rest will come out throughout the year. And what the discs contain is 100 of these films.
Wow.
With a lot of other material, program notes about the films and about what they mean, that 3-inch high Rick that tells you what to think. There's an introduction on every disc.
Yeah.
There's a lot of material to supply. You know, when you see something like this, you laugh, but it's not enough. You've got to know who made the films, when and why, what were they in response to. So the discs explore these subjects and have advertising and interviews and pictures and all kinds of stuff that helps contextualize them. And the discs also follow themes. They're on things like consumerism and design, about work and how it was shown in the mass media, about teenage transgression, which is juvenile delinquency, the landscape, menace and jeopardy, propaganda, sex, technology, conformity, you name it, things, pretty basic subjects to understanding our century.
One of the things you said in Toronto that I thought was fascinating is part of the clips you have, and if you can describe this, and because I don't think they were on the set, I had a chance to look at, is you actually had outtakes from some of these films. So here you see all these actors and actresses who seem so plastic, so unreal in these films, but then between shots you get to see them being very natural, which I think is fascinating. Can you describe that?
You kind of said it. I mean, some of these films look like they were played by androids. They're just too weird to be real. You somehow can't imagine that thinking human beings would like write a movie like this and then shoot it and then act in it. And I found on some of them outtakes, and you know, there's Kodachrome outtakes look like they were shot yesterday, and it reminds us that like real people made projects out of this. Probably the way like public access will look in 40 years.
Although I think we tend to look very real, whatever the case. This is pretty raw as it is, for the most part, community access. But I'm curious though, could you describe like one scene where what the character was doing, supposed to be doing in the film, and then what they were saying when they weren't in their plastic character?
Oh, well, you can't really tell because I'm not a
Okay.
lip reader, but you can see people blowing it.
Oh, so you don't hear the sound.
Yeah, you can see people blowing it and
Yeah.
coming back. And you can see, like when kids are showing how you're not supposed to behave at the table.
Yeah.
Like you're not supposed to talk about gory things or
Yeah.
discuss the rest of your family. You can see a couple kids getting into it a little too much. And those were scenes that were cut
Yeah.
out of the final movie.
That is funny. And you have them
Yeah.
there
Oh, yeah,
in
yeah.
the film. And I was hoping to have a contents shot. He has a table of contents because it's CD-ROM. And some of the stuff he has is scrapbooks, which is also, like you were saying, giving the whole picture, which is the advertising campaign that associates it. And the one I saw was the Frigidaire.
Yes.
It was a fabulous clip. Why don't you describe it? The one where they have this big elaborate dance number. It's around the stoves and the ovens.
This is a crazy film. It was made around 1957. Excuse me. And in 1957, I guess they decided up at Frigidaire that ice boxes were no longer going to be rounded. We're going to lose that friendly 50s roundness, and they were going to start being squared off.
Yeah.
So this is a film showing a couple dancing around refrigerators and ranges and ovens and freezers and all this stuff, and doing this sort of,
Right.
Astaire and Rogers type act. And at the end, they hold their hands out, and you
Right.
see a slide that says, the sheer look is here and the strange gesture. You may see the strange gesture. And so we have a little supplement on the disc that shows the print ads
Yeah.
with models going like this, and it explains it and makes it clear, and it suddenly like throws the movie into a new
Right.
context. I mean, another example of that is we have a lot of safety
Yeah.
films. There's a disc about safety films, and we show why the safety films were made. It
Right.
isn't to prevent accidents, and in many cases it's to
Yeah.
take the responsibility away from the corporations and to place it
Right.
on the drivers or on the workers or on the people that are the victims of the accidents.
Yeah, that's interesting. That's an interesting point, that the propaganda that's involved. What's interesting in any of your research that you've done with all these films? I mean, because to us right now, it seems very transparent. And as you were saying, as a kid, and you thought that the other kids in your class, maybe I'm putting words in your mouth on this one, all saw through it. Is there any type of studies about the effectiveness of these films? What attitude changes they caused, or what people thought of them at the time? Have you seen any works or research in relation to that?
There's a little bit. Some of the films were reviewed by like panels of educators, and
Yeah.
also reviewed in the press. In those days, 40s and 50s, they used to review educational and advertising films in magazines.
Right.
So there's some criticism of it, and there's some, praise. There's no, like, if the big question is, did they work? Were they
Right.
effective? Did we have a generation of well-behaved kids because
Yeah.
of these movies? And the answer is obviously not.
Yeah.
I mean, you can argue, on the other hand, that these films had a lot to do with creating the climate that led to the 60s movement,
Right.
to the social activism and, the birth of a counterculture. I think the way to look at them is different. These films are like a peek inside of the head
Yeah.
of educators,
Right.
manufacturers, the clergy,
Yeah.
psychologists, sociologists. It's what they wanted us to believe. It's like these are the messages that were coming from the top down. That's where it starts getting interesting, because it's the history of how we were supposed to be.
Right, exactly, and that's what I loved how you said it in your introduction. This is also a good way to look at the way we were, and also the way we were supposed to be. And that's the image. And I think it's very important what your CD collection does, because especially with like nostalgia of like we need to go back to family values. I mean, these are the images that people are talking about. And that's why when you see these things at Nick at Night, even though they do parodies of them, this is what people associate with. But what you're trying to do is kind of show what was around these films, not just simply the films themselves.
Well, this stuff's very funny, but you
Yeah.
have to go beyond that, because,
Right.
pure nostalgia is, there's a problem with pure nostalgia, because
Yeah.
nostalgia is something that's created quite often for business
Yeah.
reasons. It's like, feeling of a warm glow about something
Right.
that never really existed. It wasn't a nice time in the 50s. It wasn't
Yeah.
any simpler then than it is now. And
Right.
people were worried very much about the same kinds of things. And I'm trying to use these discs to
Yeah.
get people to look at the present with a little bit more
Right.
You know, context and distance. You know, when we talk about the kids today, for example, there's a big problem with juvenile crime
Right.
in this country. There was the same thing in the 50s, except in the 50s, the predominant belief was that kids could be redeemed.
Yeah.
You know, that kids could be helped, and now we don't kind of
Believe that
institutionally, it doesn't seem to be the same way.
Right,
So it's
that
kind of worth looking back
We
at
have
some of
to
these
totally
old.
change everything in the institutions. We got a call on line one. Let's go ahead and take it. Hello.
Hello, Mike.
Hi. Who's this?
I have a question. I was wondering how you can figure out how people actually lived based on these Madison Avenue kind of movies. I'm sure people back then laughed at the content of these films as well.
Oh, very good question. A lot of these films are very stagey, and they were made in a studio just like this, and they star actors. But a lot of them don't. A lot of them use real people in real homes, and they use non-professional actors who don't kind of behave in a Hollywood way. And you just get a real feeling of some kind of authenticity there. It's real flawed evidence. I think the caller makes a very good point there. But for me, it's, I mean, half of our history is how we actually were, and the other half is the models that were held up in front of us, kind of the construction of our personalities in everyday life. And I think the films illuminate that half of it, and then often cross over to show something that's a good deal more authentic. The most authentic of all, of course, is home movies. Amateur films.
Right.
And this is a very important issue for our archives right now. We have
the Prelinger Archives.
the Prelinger Archives, my archives in New York, I've started to collect home movies very seriously because those are the time capsules.
Right.
That's popular expression. That's what real people did. They picked up the camera to record what was around them, and you know, they're pretty ritualistic too.
Right.
But those are real evidence. So I actually have a little nationwide campaign going to collect home movies for our archives.
Did you happen to have one of your flyers with you?
I don't have a flyer, but I'll be like Ross Perot and give out my 800 number. I would.
I think you can do that. I think as long as it's not for money or for political campaigns, you can.
No, nothing
you can
political.
Yeah.
We think that film should be in film archives where it will be preserved, and I'm very interested in acquiring home movies and talking to people about that. And anybody who likes can call me toll free at 1-800-400. 4657.
There's no acronym like 4657 isn't film or home or anything like that.
1-800-400-4657.
Okay, and so that's if you have some home movies to donate. Tell me some of the ones you've gotten there. What are some of the scenes you've seen? Some of the more offbeat ones, or some things that are common to all home movies?
Well, there's a lot of things to say about home movies. I'll recall some scenes that are kind of interesting. We acquired the home movies of the Levy family, Levy's Rye Bread, the famous campaign,
really?
You don't have to be Jewish to love Levy's. And the Levys during the Depression, since they owned a bakery, had a lot of bread. Not everybody did. So they would feed the birds with bread. And you see them at the beach in Florida throwing bread out to the birds, and suddenly the frame is filled with bread and birds gobbling it up. And this is a celebration, you know, of their success. It's wonderful. It's one of these things that's a lot more than what it looks like. There's wonderful home movies of the New York World's Fair. There's a lot of great home movies, you know, that show how families change over time. You know, mysterious disappearance of people from home movies when they reach adolescence. You know, and they get kind of self-conscious about their appearance. They don't want to be photographed anymore. Lots of weddings, never a funeral. It's, you know, one of the reasons to collect a lot of home movies, besides preserving them, and we want to keep them safe for 100 or 200 years, is to kind of understand the rules of the game, to study these rituals and see what it is about a camera that changed the way people act.
One thing I was thinking, if you have a lot of people who were at the World's Fair, and you get to see it from so many different families.
Different angles, yeah.
And what have you noticed similarities or differences of an event like the World's Fair being covered from all these different regions of the country? Like what different people focused in, or did they always get the same things? What were some of the things you may have noticed in that?
Well, when you look at like the 1939-40 New York World's
Right.
Fair, a lot of people were interested in, you know, the commercial pavilions, the big national cash register at GM and Ford,
Yeah.
and some people were interested in the national pavilions, Belgium and Japan and the USSR. But the ones that always bug me are the people that shot the flower beds, you know, and the, and the plants and the monkeys, because those things don't change. You know,
Right.
they're not so historical. It's when you see people and you see things that are very
Exactly.
time-based that it's great.
It's funny you mentioned that because my family, and I'm keeping these, I'm not giving them to you. My grandparents filmed their lives in the 30s, and what they would do is they'd go on vacations and they'd film the Washington Monument, the Potomac River, and all the scenery, and then you'd get this quick shot of the people who were with them, and that is what you really wanted to see. You wanted to see your grandparents when they were younger and how they acted, and those were brief shots because what to get was the scenery, the things like you say that never
Which
change.
doesn't move either.
Right.
I mean, the Washington Monument, you know, is
Well, the
rooted.
camera moves up and down it.
Yeah, but it doesn't quite make it. But then again,
Right.
you'll find, you know, wonderful, wonderful home movies
Yeah.
that tell a story or that show a place like nothing else.
Right. Now, do you plan to produce any type of CD-ROMs? Do you have any ideas of what you might want to do with it? Well, I know there's a privacy issue, so I don't know if you
Yeah.
can really repackage them.
It would depend. The main thing is to preserve them. You know, we
Yeah.
have low temperature, low humidity storage.
Yeah.
So we think, you know, all film tends to deteriorate over time, but we think we can keep it safe for, you know, 100, 150 years. That presume, you know, under those conditions, I don't think I'll be
Yeah.
around for
Right.
that. But I have used amateur film on some of the CD-ROMs
Yeah.
on the landscape disc. We visit Britain, South Dakota in 1938 with some wonderful home movies made by Ivan Bessie. And then there's a sequence where I go back to that town in 1991, and there's some of my snapshots on the disc. And so it explores what happened to that Depression landscape in 53 years.
Right. So I think we got another call. Let's check it out. Hello?
Hi. Yeah, I had a question for you. What is the single most preposterous film that you've got in your collection?
Oh, there's so many. How can I do this? I mean, A Date with Your Family is certainly one of them. The idea that children should lie.
Yeah.
I think, you know, a lot of the grooming films tend to be most surreal because they have these incredibly bizarre role models. I mean, no kid was ever like this. And then they have the bad kids. It's the kind of Goofus and Gallant thing, remember? Highlights magazine, but it's so extreme in order to get kids' attention. Oh, well, I'll tell you what one of the most bizarre films is. It's on my ephemeral films disc. It's called In My Merry Oldsmobile, made by Max Fleischer for Oldsmobile in 1931. And that's a film that, if it was made today, you know, you couldn't show it to kids. It was made to promote Oldsmobiles, and I'm going to just say you should go down, you know, to the bookstore and look at the CD-ROM.
Right.
It's filled with so much like dirty innuendo visually. You can't imagine like the Oldsmobile executives signing off on it.
So do you have any other questions?
And I guess, what would you say would be like the thing that maybe still rings true somehow? You know, the other end of the scale.
A lot of things that are in these films ring true. I mean, you know, you should drive safely. You know, you should drive soberly.
Right.
You should treat your date with respect.
Yeah.
You know, a lot of that's true. It's more in the way that they say it. A lot of the advice in these films is true, and there's a core of truth. It's more the idea that kids couldn't make up their own minds, that consumers were like clay to be modeled, you know, by the giant corporations and ad agencies. It's much more the manner of address, I think.
I mean, it's true too, because I even saw recently there was one about a grooming where it showed somebody who wasn't like dressed well, a girl who wasn't dressed well, a teenager, and it showed her socks halfway down and another one up, and it showed people passing judgments on them and what they thought of her in their own mind, and then later on she learns how to get dressed up, and that was and I think that is still true today. People do pass those judgments. Not that, again, like you were saying, that a narrator comes in and says, yes, you want to look real good, but people do pass those judgments, like they were suggesting. People are looking and saying those things in their heads about other people. You hear that all the time.
The other thing about these films is that there's a real sense of it's who they're talking to, and like there's sex education films for boys versus sex education films for girls. The ones for boys are about how to deal with like pleasure and desire, but the ones for girls are about enduring your monthly period, about adapting. And that's a pretty big message. It's saying that to be a girl or a woman is undesirable, that it's a state of sickness, periodically, whereas for boys, sex is fun.
It's interesting, because I never saw those films. I've never even, they actually had ones, I mean, how would they give that message? Because sex, I've never seen any of those type of films really deal with male sexuality, like that they actually say it can be how to have pleasure. I mean, what age was this bracketed at?
Teens.
Really? And would it be shown in high school?
Yeah.
Would they really say this is?
They don't quite say it that way, but they talk about, I don't know how much detail I want to go into here, but they talk about, boys experiencing sex as a pleasurable thing. They don't talk about anything like that in the films for girls.
Right.
I mean, girls are there to like have babies.
Yeah, that's interesting. I wanted to ask you a couple questions just about the archives.
Yeah.
Now, these 33,000 films, they're not all kept in one central place somewhere in the United States. They're kept in different locations, correct? Or?
We have a number of different locations. We have one big research area where material is cataloged, and a lot of it is stored in New York.
Right. And so where are the different places that they are kept throughout the country?
The majority of our materials in the New York metro area. There's a lot of stuff that I haven't moved back to New York yet because it's cheaper to keep it close to where it was originally acquired.
Yeah.
I'm still keeping a little material up in Pontiac, for example, because it's cheaper to keep it there. One of these days, as we expand our storage facility and build more shelves, I'll bring it all back.
Okay, so the goal is to keep it all
eventually, because the important thing is to be able to work with it and to make it available to people.
Right. Okay, let's, we got a call on line one. Why don't we grab it? Hello?
Hi, Mike. It's Terry. Hi, Rick.
Hi, Terry.
Hi,
Hey,
Terry.
I have a question. I know that on the videotapes, the Ephemeral Films videotapes, there is no narrator, right? They're just clips, sort of a little bit of information. Rick, why did you decide to put yourself in the CD-ROM as the little Rick?
Really good question. At the beginning, with an early CD of mine, Ephemeral Films, I wanted to let the films speak for themselves, because usually when you see historical footage on TV, there's a narrator, it's cut up, some kind of interference with the films themselves. On Secret Century, we were trying for something that was a little more complicated. I was trying to express really to say, that there has been, throughout the century, a pretty massive effort to get people to think and behave in predictable ways. You might call it a conspiracy, you might just call it an effort, who knows? But I need, this is me saying it, and I needed to measure up, I needed to kind of stand up to that and accept the fact that I was going to make a thesis here and ask people to think that way. It's optional. You don't have to click that button and listen to the little Rick, and you don't have to read my program notes. But if you do, it's me saying it. And that becomes kind of important. This is not a textbook, that for the public schools it's supposed to be objective. This is me. It's like my rant. My ideas, and I think that's an authorial presence. And a lot of CD-ROMs are corporate works. They don't have any personality behind them at all. It could have been made by robots by the time everybody gets through working with them. And a book has an author. You can blame the ideas on somebody, and you can blame me for what's on the CDs.
Terry, do you have any other comments to add? Hello?
Hi.
Oh, anything else to add, Terry?
No, that's a good answer.
Okay.
I like it that way. I mean, I'm not saying it's a bad choice. I was just curious because I knew that you had sort of had that reaction to those heavy-handed narrators that are in some of their films. And
Right.
just wanted to hear you talk about that.
I also think, history is like a kaleidoscope or something. It's prismatic. There's a lot of different ways to look at the same thing. This is my way, and I'm trying to facilitate other people to look at this material from their own point of view. Until recently, nobody had access to this kind of material. When you buy the Our Secret
Right.
Century CDs, you have 100 films. You have 20 hours
Right.
of material to look at. That's a little archive on your, on your
Exactly.
computer.
Anything else to add, Terry?
No, thanks. Okay.
Okay, thank you for
Okay.
calling in.
Sure. Bye.
That's the thing I would say I love. I agree with Terry on this, that that's what I think is so good about it, is that you're in there and it's your personality and it's you speaking. And because I remember learning about that growing up, is like you don't try to personalize yourself at all. Nobody cares what you think. You don't say I statements. So when you write out theses or whatever, persuasion papers, you try to always objectify and say one instead of I. And because no one cares what you think, but yet I think it's very important to inject your personality. Plus you do give the people the choice. The whole films are there. They're not chopped up. And you...
Yeah.
And your interpretations are great. I mean, have you ever taught a course at all, or taught a college course?
No, not really.
I mean, you'd be a great lecturer. I mean, because I was just watching that, and I thought that would make a great course. You'd be a very, popular college lecturer, because that was what it was like, seeing the little screen. And again, I'm repeating myself, but I think that's what CD-ROM should be like, and hopefully somebody else will follow your lead here.
Well, everything should be, everybody should work out their own way to deal with this
Right.
material, but it's an enthusiastic
Yeah.
recommendation, which I'm very grateful for.
Right. Well, at least some other people do, because I think that's true, that there isn't as much personality involved with that. I wanted to ask a few more questions just about the making of that. That you must have spent hours just picking the little clips. Even in the little introduction that we saw, they were just selected clips that very well accentuated and complemented what you were saying in your introduction and brought it out very well.
Everybody thinks CDs are something new, but the biggest effort on the CDs
Right.
was writing.
Exactly.
I've written 75,000 words for these CDs so far.
Yeah.
And, I write the intros, and then I think about what kind of clips should go in there, and then, we knit it all together
Exactly,
electronically.
and the knitting is, and integrating it all in your head before you get to the CD-ROM. CD-ROM just allows you to do that in new ways. You just couldn't do some of the things that you did before, but like you said, and that's why I was just amazed at how well you chose the clips you did and how much work that took. Or were you already so familiar with many of the films in your collections that as you were writing it out, you just thought, oh, that would be the perfect clip, or was there a lot of time?
Both.
Yeah.
Both things are true. I mean, I'm familiar with the material, but it's a lot of work. And it's really hard to do the writing. Optical media, CD is optical. Once
Right.
it's pressed, it's forever.
Yeah.
And you really, it's chilling, because you
Yeah.
got to think about what you're going to say, because you cannot change it.
Right.
And when I was writing about such topics as sexuality and patriotism, it's sometimes hard to put yourself. I mean, I'm not saying I'm a big hero or anything,
Right.
but you really think about what you need to say.
Yeah, exactly. That is a lot of work, and in writing, I also just to get to do the introduction and just to be reciting the words like you did it very naturally. I mean, did you have
Took
to
a lot
do
of
a lot
work.
of takes?
The first few discs, I did a bunch of takes, and then
Right.
afterwards I got the hang of it, and I did everything in 1 or 2 takes.
How big was your team of people working on this?
Well, it's been produced and will be published by the Voyager Company, which is a big publisher of interesting and challenging CD-ROMs.
Right.
The key people were a producer, Melanie
Yeah.
Goldstein, and later Beth Strauss, a designer, Diane Bertola, who built that beautiful graphic look that's not nostalgic.
Yeah.
A really gifted programmer, Colin Holgate, who figured out how to do a million things.
That's
and then
great.
a tremendous number of
Yeah.
other people. You know,
Yeah.
probably 40 people. You look at the credits. There's
Yeah.
a tremendous number of names,
Could-
and they made it work on both Mac and Windows, which is really
that's-
hard.
I mean, so the CD I use can easily just be plopped into a Windows platform.
Windows or Macintosh.
That's incredible. So you don't need a separate set.
no.
That is amazing.
Yeah.
And in so doing, like, so the woman, I forget her name, who did the graphics,
Diane Bertola.
and she did, because that also makes that incredible, the backdrops to all these things. She picked those and went through the films, or how
Yes.
much? And,
Yes.
Okay.
She's responsible for the visual
Okay.
look of the whole disc, and we work together on
Sure.
some of the other sequences too.
Okay, well, I got to wrap up the show. I'm so glad you came on to talk about everything, and I'm glad we got a chance to see an introduction. And I want to thank you again, Rick, for coming on the show and explaining about your collection and showing us your CD-ROM.
No, it's my pleasure. Thanks a lot.
Okay, thanks again. Okay. Wow.
I was singing with my echo, a duet for me by me.